I first noticed it on a wet Tuesday in March, while sitting in the dimly lit basement of the university's archive lab, the kind of place where time doesn't move quite right. The air always smells faintly of dust and vinegar, and the only sound is the hum of scanners breathing life into old photographs. I was digitizing materials from the RAF Visual Record Project, a collaboration between our history department and the British Ministry of Defence. Most of it was routine: flight manifests, coded telegrams, press photos of smiling young men who didn't live to see 30. My job was to scan, tag, and archive every image. No commentary, no analysis, just numbers and metadata. But that afternoon, one photograph refused to behave. It was labeled RAF number 247 Squadron, 1940, Manston Airfield. The dozen. A simple group portrait. 11 pilots and one mechanic standing in front of a Hawker Hurricane, the aircraft's propeller frozen mid-turn. The men wore their service blues, caps tilted, some smiling, some not. It had the casual symmetry of wartime photography, stoic, hopeful, unaware of what history had planned for them. The negative was on deteriorating nitrate film, its edges browned like burnt paper. I handled it with gloved care, slid it onto the scanner bed, and hit capture. The image appeared on screen, clear, high contrast, beautifully preserved for something nearly a century old. I leaned closer, counting the men, preparing to label their names in the metadata. And that's when I realized there were 13 faces. I froze. The back row, left to right, had one too many men. 12 were documented in the flight roster, all accounted for in mission logs and casualty lists. But there, wedged between two officers, was another man, slightly out of alignment, his expression unreadable. His face was pale, not faded, not underexposed, just unnaturally white, as though he'd been standing under a different light altogether. His eyes, wide and steady, looked directly into the lens. There was no name tag visible on his tunic, and no record number stitched above his pocket. Something about the way he stood unsettled me. The others looked alive, shifting slightly, shoulders slouched, boots in the mud. But this man was perfectly still, his posture rigid, hands hidden behind his back. I blinked and leaned closer. For a moment I thought I saw moisture on his face. Condensation, maybe. Then I noticed his cap. It wasn't regulation RAF issue. I zoomed in further, and the scanner whined softly as the image pixelated. The brim of his cap bore a faint insignia, a stylized falcon instead of the RAF crown and wing emblem. That's when I checked the accompanying record card. It listed the 12 men, including Flight Lieutenant Alistair Croft, who, according to a side note, was declared missing in action over the English Channel, September 15th, 1940, 3 days before the photo was supposedly taken. 3 days. I sat back, my hands hovering above the keyboard. I told myself it was a clerical error, an innocent mislabeling. Maybe the photo had been taken earlier. Wartime record-keeping wasn't perfect, but the back of the photograph, the physical print, which I now lifted from its sleeve, had a stamp that said, "Taken 18 September 1940, Manston Airfield. Photographer, Sergeant Colin W. Farrow," and underneath, in faded pencil, all 12, before the night patrol. 12. Not 13. The discrepancy nagged at me for hours. I ran the photo through the database cross-reference. No match for any additional pilot assigned to the squadron. I even checked for duplicates in the roles of nearby units. Nothing. Then I made the mistake of enhancing the scan. Under higher exposure, the shadows behind the men deepened, except behind the 13th. Where each officer's boots cast faint shadows on the tarmac, his did not. The space around his legs was blank, as if the light had passed through him. I stared until my eyes watered. The hum of the scanner seemed louder now, insistent. I saved the file, labeled it RAF 247 September 1940 Anomaly 01, and told myself to log it later, but I couldn't leave it alone. Something in that photograph demanded attention, like an unfinished sentence. That night, I emailed my supervisor, Professor Graham, a retired military historian who had served briefly in the RAF himself before turning to academia. I attached the photo and a simple note. Sir, please see attached. 247 Squadron group photo shows one additional individual not listed in Squadron roster. Possibly a duplication error in exposure. Please advise. He replied at 2:17 a.m., which was typical of him. Good eye. You're not the first to notice that one. That photo has been giving archivists headaches for 70 years. We call him the 13th Airman. The official line is double exposure. The unofficial line, well, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Don't lose sleep over it. I stared at the email. Don't lose sleep over it. It was exactly the kind of thing you say when you know someone will. The next morning, I went back through the archives. There were 3 other versions of the same photograph, contact prints made from the same negative. 2 were identical, but one was slightly different. In the 3rd copy, the 13th man's head was tilted, just a fraction, maybe 5 degrees, and his mouth was open. It looked almost as if he'd been about to speak. I printed both versions and laid them side by side. The difference was subtle, but undeniable. Every other man was frozen exactly the same between both shots. Same folds in fabric, same expressions, except him. That's when I noticed something else. In the first version, the pilot beside him, identified as Squadron Leader Hargreaves, had a cigarette between his fingers. In the second, it was gone. His hand was empty, and in the faint space between their shoulders, a wisp of smoke curled upward, toward the 13th man's mouth. By noon, I'd stopped scanning new materials and started hunting for anything mentioning the 13th Airman. Most of what I found was folklore. A 1958 RAF veteran newsletter mentioned the photo, calling it the Manston Spectre. Another article from 1972 dismissed it as an optical duplication caused by moisture on the lens. Yet several correspondences in the 1980s, now scanned in brittle carbon copy type, showed former ground crew from 247 Squadron arguing over whether Croft had actually returned to base that night. One wrote, I saw Croft's Hurricane over the channel at dawn. Engine failure, trailing smoke. He didn't make it back. But 3 nights later, someone claimed they saw his plane's lights circling the airfield before disappearing into cloud. Another, unsigned, said, they buried an empty coffin. I read that line 5 times. Then I looked again at the photograph. At the man who shouldn't be there. The lab was empty by late afternoon, the others having left for the day. I stayed, convincing myself I was finishing paperwork. The truth was, I wanted to be alone with the image. I loaded the negative back onto the scanner, switching it to high-resolution mode. The hum filled the room like distant static. On the monitor, the details sharpened until the grain itself seemed to breathe. That's when I saw it. Something I hadn't noticed before. The reflection on the Hurricane's cockpit glass. It showed the backs of the men, faint silhouettes distorted by curvature. But in the reflection, the 13th man wasn't facing forward. He was turned toward the others, looking directly at them, and his mouth was open wider now. I jerked back from the screen so hard the chair rolled against the counter. The scan completed with a faint chime. I saved it automatically, heart thudding. The file name appeared as usual, except one small change. The system had saved it not as anomaly_02, but as Croft_02.tif. I hadn't typed that. I shut down the scanner and backed up the data. But even at home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd carried something with me, not physically, but in my thoughts, the way certain tunes linger long after they've stopped playing. That night, while editing metadata, I opened the image again. For a split second, the display glitched, a brief flash of white static, and the photo loaded slightly distorted. The men's faces appeared sharper, except one. The 13th man now seemed to be smiling, not wide, not friendly, just a faint curve, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. I shut my laptop and walked away. But when I came back later, the photo had duplicated itself in the project folder. 2 identical files, same name, same timestamp. And on the second one, when I hovered over the thumbnail, the preview showed a different scene entirely, an empty airfield, the hurricane alone. That was the night I started keeping the photo in a separate folder, off the main archive, off the university server. I told myself it was professional caution, but in truth, I didn't want anyone else to open it, because I had begun to feel something when I looked at it, something like attention, not from me to it, but from it to me, as though somewhere inside the pixels of that 70-year-old photograph, the 13th man had noticed he'd been found, and he was waiting for me to look again. It began as curiosity, the kind that starts small, like an itch at the base of the mind. But by the end of the week, it had grown into something else. I couldn't concentrate on anything that wasn't that photograph. The image of those 12 young men, and the 13th, had colonized my thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I could picture them lined up in the damp English light, shoulders squared, the smell of oil and grass thick in the air. But it wasn't their faces that haunted me. It was his. The pale man in the back row, the one with no shadow. I needed to know who he was. So I started where any good researcher would, with the flight logs. The Royal Air Force kept meticulous records during the war, daily flight reports, crew assignments, loss summaries. They were all stored at the National Archives in Kew, but our university had been digitizing secondary reels. When I entered 247 Squadron, September 1940, I found dozens of sorties listed between the 10th and the 18th. Every line item had a name, a plane serial, and a brief note about outcome. I scrolled until I found Flight Lieutenant Alistair Croft. His final entry read, Sortie 0915, patrol over channel, Hurricane P3207. Last radio contact 17:34 hours, lost from radar, presumed downed. That was dated September 15th, 1940, 3 days before the photo. There was no subsequent record of his recovery, burial, or even wreckage. His name appeared in the roll of the missing, issued later that year. And yet, there he was in the picture, if it truly was him. Sergeant Colin Farrow, the RAF photographer credited with taking the image, had left behind fragments of his diary, fragile leather-bound journals donated to the Imperial War Museum. Most entries were factual, dull even, weather reports, lens calibrations, aircraft serial numbers. But the one dated September 18th, 1940 stood out. It read, Manston, Squadron 247. Group shot requested before patrol. Odd light today. Mist over field, though sun clear overhead. Took 3 plates. Second plate overexposed on left margin. Crew uneasy. Croft's mates joking he made it back from the drink. Didn't understand. Said they buried him last week. Thought it bad taste. He added a line, written later in darker ink. Developed negatives tonight. Third plate has 1 too many men. Counted twice. I felt my skin tighten. When I brought my findings to Professor Graham, he didn't look surprised. He just rubbed at his eyes, the lenses of his glasses catching the grey lab light. You're not the first, he said quietly. That photo's been whispered about since the 60s. Every few decades, some archivist digs it up again, sees what you saw, and starts chasing ghosts. I'd advise you not to join them. But sir, I said, there's documented evidence the man in the photo was missing. The photographer even notes, "I've read Farrow's journal," he interrupted. The ministry dismissed it as fatigue. Wartime conditions, long hours in the darkroom can make shadows where there are none. He leaned forward, voice lowering. "Do yourself a favor, Lang. Finish the digitization. Leave the rest buried." But I couldn't, because even as he spoke, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Behind him, on his office shelf, was a framed print of RAF memorabilia, and at the center of the display, partly hidden behind a book spine, was the same photograph, the same face. I found him in the university's oral history database. Wing Commander Peter Hargreaves, age 102, one of the last living members of 247 Squadron. He'd given an interview in 2014 to a graduate researcher. The transcript ran 68 pages, most of it stories about training, camaraderie, and the sheer exhaustion of the Blitz. But near the end, the interviewer mentioned the group photo. Interviewer: "There's a famous picture from that month, 12 men before the hurricane. Do you remember it being taken?" Hargreaves: 13. Interviewer: "Sorry." Hargreaves: "There were 13 of us." Interviewer: "Official records only list 12. Hargreaves: "Aye. That's the point, isn't it?" Then a long pause followed, and the old man added softly, "We buried Croft. I watched them lower the box, but he was there, plain as day, when Farrow took that picture, white as milk, eyes like frost." The interviewer tried to press further, but the session ended there. Hargreaves requested no follow-up. That night I dreamed of the airfield. I was standing in the same spot as the photographer, the camera cold against my hands. The men were assembled in their uniforms, the smell of aviation fuel thick and acrid. A wind tugged at their caps. Then one of them turned, not toward me, but toward something behind the plane. A figure approached through the fog, not walking, gliding, silent, as if the ground itself carried him. His face was white, lips gray, and his eyes reflected light like glass. When he reached the group, the others didn't react. He took his place among them and looked straight at me. When the shutter clicked, the world went black. I woke with the sound of propellers echoing in my ears. 2 weeks later, I received a brown envelope from the Air Historical Branch, responding to my request for non-sensitive RAF photography correspondence, 1940 to 42. Inside were 5 carbon copies of typed memos, most trivial. But the last one froze me. To Air Ministry Records Division, from RAF Intelligence Section D, Kent Command. Date, 21st September 1940. Following the disappearance of Flight Lieutenant Croft, P3207, an unusual occurrence reported by 247 Squadron personnel. Group photograph taken on the 18th of September appears to show Croft present among living members. Multiple witnesses confirm he was presumed deceased. Film examined by photographic technicians. No evidence of double exposure. Matter referred to intelligence for review. Recommend no further distribution of image. Below that, in red pencil, file sealed, 1971, reopen only upon ministerial request. The stamp on the envelope was from 1989. Someone had reopened it, and whoever it was, they'd never refiled it correctly, which is how it ended up in my hands. I didn't tell anyone when I started keeping a printout of the photo pinned above my desk. At first it was purely academic, a way to stare at the anomaly while I worked. But over time, I realized I was checking it compulsively, as though waiting for something to change. And then, one morning, something did. The photograph was different. Not drastically, not in any way I could prove, but subtle things. The fog behind the hurricane was darker, the shadows stretched a little longer, and the 13th man's head seemed slightly turned. It was impossible, of course. The print was static, but my eyes wouldn't stop telling me otherwise. I took a digital photo of the printout for comparison. The file metadata listed the timestamp correctly, but when I tried to open it, the image came up black for several seconds before fading in. The 13th man was gone, just empty space between the others. I looked up at the printed version on my wall. He was still there, and I could swear, though I'll never be able to prove it, that his eyes were now looking directly at me. You can decide whether to keep the continuity connection with Lars from the Tersil story. Here, he can be the digital archivist mentor who assists remotely. I sent the image to Lars, our department's senior digitization engineer. He'd worked on spectral imaging for war photography, and if anyone could debunk this, it was him. He called me the next evening, his voice unusually quiet. "Miriam, where did you get this?" "From the RAF project. Why?" "Because I ran the spectral bands. There's a fourth exposure layer, one that shouldn't exist on single-plate negatives." "Meaning?" "Meaning the camera caught something beyond visible spectrum. Infrared, maybe. But here's the thing. That layer shows only one object." "What object?" "The man in the back row." By May, I had convinced myself to visit Manston Airfield. The RAF Museum now occupied the site, a place of cheerful tourism and gift shops selling model Spitfires. But when I mentioned 247 Squadron, the archivist's demeanor changed. "You mean that photograph?" he said, lowering his voice. "It's kept in storage. Too many people kept asking to see it after the documentary." "What documentary?" I asked. He frowned. "The one they tried to film in the 80s. The crew stopped after one of the cameras caught something in the hangar." He didn't elaborate. He just handed me an access badge and pointed down a corridor that smelled faintly of oil and mildew. I found the cabinet labeled Faro, CW, 1939-41. Inside were hundreds of envelopes, patrol shots, portraits, inspection photos. At the very back, one was marked, Plate 3, Restricted. Inside, the glass negative was intact, the emulsion faintly clouded but legible. I held it up to the light. The men stood as before, lined before the hurricane. But the longer I looked, the more wrong it seemed. The man in the back wasn't in the photograph. He was behind it. His figure appeared as though recessed into the film itself, not printed on it. When I tilted the plate slightly, his outline seemed to move. The air in the archive grew colder, and from the far end of the corridor, I heard the unmistakable sound of propellers turning, faint, rhythmic, and utterly impossible. For the first few nights after finding the extra face, I convinced myself it was fatigue. The RAF collection had consumed my waking hours for weeks, thousands of negatives to clean, scan, tag, and file. It wasn't unusual to see patterns where none existed, especially after 10-hour days squinting at grainy images under artificial light. That was what I told myself anyway. Still, something about that photograph refused to settle. Every time I closed my laptop, the after-image hovered in my mind. The neat rows of men, the sharp creases of their uniforms, the bright insignia catching the sun. And there, tucked behind the last row, that unfamiliar face. Not quite blurred, but not fully there either. I'd memorized its features. Narrow, long, a faint smile that didn't belong to the moment the others were sharing. It wasn't just the face, it was the count. 26 men had served in Squadron 214 during the spring of 1940. The service records, mission logs, and casualty lists all confirmed it, but the photo, dated precisely May 12th, contained 27. The discrepancy should have been unremarkable. Archival photography often included mechanics, clerks, cooks, anyone attached to the base that day. Yet something in that figure's stillness made him stand apart. His eyes seemed unfocused, aimed slightly above the camera, as though he were watching something distant, invisible to the others. The following morning, I emailed my supervisor, Professor Lennox, to request permission for an external restoration check. I phrased it clinically: possible exposure duplication, requesting independent verification. She approved within the hour, likely relieved that my obsession might be passed off to someone else. The technician, an older man named Hughes, ran a fresh scan using a high-resolution Nikon film scanner. He leaned close to the monitor as the pixels resolved, frowning slightly. "You've got one hell of a ghosting effect," he muttered. I forced a laugh. "Not literally, I hope." "Looks that way, though." He zoomed in. "See this edge? The light doesn't match the others. The sun's hitting their faces from the left. His is lit dead on, almost like he's under a different sky." I noted the phrasing, "under a different sky," and told myself it was just metaphor. Hughes finished the scan and saved 3 copies. 1 color-corrected, 1 infrared, 1 untouched. He sent them to my archive folder and handed me the original print in a plastic sleeve. "Probably a composite error," he said. "Old cameras sometimes overlapped exposures by a few millimeters. Could have happened in processing. That should have been the end of it. But that night, while reviewing the infrared scan, I noticed something that shouldn't have been there. In the far corner of the image, beyond the last row of airmen, was the faint outline of a hangar door. It hadn't been visible in the normal scan, and on the threshold of that hangar, barely discernible, stood another shape. Tall, featureless, like a shadow caught mid-step. I increased the brightness until the pixels broke apart. There was no face, no uniform, just the suggestion of motion. An arm, perhaps, extended outward. I closed the file and shut down my computer. But long after I'd turned off the lights, I could still see the faint silhouette burned into the darkness behind my eyelids. I didn't mention the new discovery to anyone at first. Archivists learn quickly that credibility is fragile. Once people sense eccentricity, they stop trusting your data. Still, the thought gnawed at me. If the figure in the back row didn't belong, who was he? I began combing through service rosters from May 1940, dozens of names, some struck through in red pencil. Pilots lost over France, mechanics reassigned to bomb disposal, 1 clerk transferred to intelligence, but none accounted for an unlisted 27th man. Then, buried in an operational diary, I found a brief note dated the same day as the photograph. Squadron reassembled following return from Lille operation. 1 flight sergeant absent without leave. Personal effects to be stored pending investigation. No name given. The absence might have meant anything. A clerical delay, illness, an unauthorized leave. But something in the phrasing, effects to be stored, implied finality. I tracked down the quartermaster's storage ledger. 1 entry was circled in faded blue ink. FSR Mallory. Personal locker. Sealed. Do not issue. Mallory. The name rang faintly familiar, though I couldn't place why. I searched the personnel records again. There was a Flight Sergeant Robert Mallory listed as presumed dead after a crash over the Channel in June 1940, 1 month after the photo. His body had never been recovered. I returned to the image. Back row, 2nd from the left. The unlisted man's face was faintly smudged, but the shape of his uniform collar bore the insignia of a flight sergeant. Mallory, or rather, something wearing Mallory's uniform. The next few days blurred into a rhythm of compulsion. I digitized, catalogued, annotated. Every lunch break dissolved into more research. Weather reports, mission logs, newspaper clippings. I learned that the May 1940 Squadron photo had been taken at RAF Bassingbourn just before their first major mission to the continent. 9 of the men in that image would die within 6 weeks. 1 entry in the squadron's diary stood out: June 19th, 1940. Aircraft N9453 failed to return from sortie. Crew presumed lost. Pilot, Lieutenant Harris. Navigator, FS, Mallory. Mallory again. But there was a postscript added later in another hand, likely the commanding officer's. Aircraft reported sighted by Coastal Watch at 0200 hours. Description uncertain. No visual identification. Signal interference noted. Signal interference. I went home that night with the photograph in my satchel. It was a breach of protocol, but the archive had begun to feel oppressive. The fluorescent lights too bright, the hum of the scanners too loud. At home, I could study in silence. I pinned the print above my desk under a warm lamp and sat back. The men stared out at me, their smiles brittle, their eyes ringed with fatigue. The extra face in the back row seemed sharper now, though I hadn't touched the image. The line of his jaw was distinct, the curve of his smile more pronounced. I leaned forward. There was something faint on his collar. An insignia, but not one I recognized. A shape like a downward-pointing wing, or perhaps a claw. My chest tightened. I knew RAF insignia well. I'd catalogued hundreds. This one didn't exist. That night, I dreamed I was standing among them, the pilots, the gunners, the mechanics, each frozen in their pose, uniforms pressed, boots polished. The air smelled of oil and damp wool. Someone behind me whispered, "Count again." When I turned, there were 28. The next morning, I found my email from Hughes waiting in my inbox. Subject, about that RAF scan. Miriam. I went over the original negative again. There's no sign of double exposure or tampering, but I did notice something odd. The silver nitrate emulsion around the extra figure is fresh, like it didn't age the same as the rest. That's chemically impossible unless the image was added years later, but it's definitely on the original plate. Out of curiosity, I ran a spectral analysis. The wavelength pattern doesn't match daylight. Looks like it was exposed under infrared. Can you check whether that base used experimental film stock in 1940? Infrared film. It hadn't been introduced into standard RAF use until years later. I wrote back immediately, but the email bounced. His address no longer existed. I tried calling his workshop. A woman answered and told me Hughes had been taken ill 2 nights ago. Some kind of seizure. He was still unconscious. When I hung up, the silence in my flat felt unnatural, dense. I turned on the kettle just to fill it. Steam curled upward, distorting the edge of the photograph pinned above my desk. For a moment, I thought the paper was moving, warping. I leaned closer, heart racing. Number. The faces were steady. The airmen stared forward as they always had. All except one. The extra face had turned slightly, just enough that its gaze now met mine. That was when I began keeping a log. Day 1, 22:14. Minor visual distortion, possibly due to fatigue. Day 2, 02:05. Sound of distant propellers outside, though no aircraft visible. Day 3, 18:47. Smell of oil and smoke near desk. Checked boiler. No leak. The log became a ritual, a way to measure sanity by increments. If I wrote it down, it was still observable, still part of the physical world. But the events escalated beyond notation. One evening, while transcribing a diary entry from the same squadron, my computer speakers emitted a faint hiss, like static. I hadn't connected any audio files. Then a low voice broke through, fractured and distant. "Grid 47, returning, can't see, over." I froze. The sound was unmistakably a radio transmission, World War II-era signal quality, filtered through decades of static. The voice repeated, softer this time, fading in and out. "Harris, do you copy? Lost in cloud. Can't see." Then silence. When I replayed the session logs, there was no recording, no audio track, no evidence. That night, I unplugged everything: computer, lamp, phone charger, and still the faint hum persisted in the room, like an engine idling somewhere just beyond the wall. The next day, I returned the photograph to the archive, or at least I intended to. But when I reached the secure storage room, the catalogue sleeve was missing. I searched every drawer, every tray. Nothing. Later that afternoon, the archive supervisor found me sitting at my workstation, staring blankly at an empty file folder. She told me gently that I'd been working too hard, that I should take some time off. I agreed. But that evening, when I returned home, the photograph was waiting on my desk. No note, no envelope, just the image, lying perfectly flat under the lamplight. There was a new mark in the corner now, a faint smudge shaped like a fingerprint. I checked my own hands. They were clean. I turned off the light. In the dark, the paper caught what little moonlight filtered through the window. For an instant I thought I saw movement within the image, the faintest shift, a flicker. The hum of engines began again, low and rhythmic. I told myself it was tinnitus, but in the stillness between beats, I could swear I heard a voice behind the sound. Count again. The following morning, I resigned from my digitization contract. I told the department I needed to focus on my thesis, though the truth was simpler. I couldn't bear another day in that building. Weeks passed, the noises stopped, the dreams faded. I started sleeping again, eating properly, speaking to friends without drifting into silence. It was easy to believe I'd imagined everything. Until the letter arrived. It was unmarked, typed on yellowing paper. Inside was a single page, stamped with the crest of the Royal Air Force Museum. The message was brief. Dear Miss Lang, we recently received a donation from the late estate of Flight Lieutenant Charles Harris, formerly of Number 214 Squadron. Among his effects was a group photograph taken in 1940. The attached note bears your name, for the girl who found Mallory. No return address, no sender. I stared at the photograph they'd enclosed, another print of the same image, identical in composition. But this time, the back row contained 26 faces. Mallory was gone, and in the far distance, above the airfield sky, a faint, dark shape hung suspended in the clouds. Not a plane. Something else. I arrived at the Royal Air Force Museum in Hendon just after 10 in the morning, clutching the folder that had kept me awake for 3 nights straight. Inside was the original 1940 Squadron photograph, the one with the extra face that shouldn't exist. I told myself I was only returning it, doing the responsible thing, closing the loop before my mind shredded itself. But as the automatic doors hissed open and I stepped into the glass atrium, the sound of my own footsteps felt unnaturally loud. The receptionist was friendly in that efficient way people are when they've seen 1,000 anxious researchers before me. She took my name, Miriam Shaw, University of Cambridge, digitization intern, and directed me to the photography archives on the upper mezzanine. Curator's name is Mr. Fallon, she said. You'll like him. Ex-RAF himself. The lift ride felt long, though it only had 2 floors to climb. Through the glass, the vast belly of a Lancaster bomber loomed above the museum floor, silver and still. I tried not to look at its black, hollow windows. Mr. Fallon met me in the viewing gallery, late 50s, grey at the temples, kind eyes behind wire frames. His handshake was dry and steady. You must be the student from Cambridge, he said, glancing at the folder in my arms. The Holt digitization project, wasn't it? That's right, I said, and my voice cracked. Except this isn't Holt. It's the 1940 Northumberland Squadron. The photograph has an anomaly. He smiled faintly, the way professionals do when undergraduates use dramatic words. Well, anomalies are what keep us in business. Let's take a look, shall we? We walked to a small consultation room lined with light boxes and scanners. The air smelled faintly of vinegar and dust, the scent of old negatives dissolving with time. I placed the photograph gently on the table and peeled back the sleeve. Fallon leaned closer. Good heavens, this is in remarkable condition. He adjusted the overhead lamp, illuminating the faces, 20 men in flight uniforms, the standard RAF group composition, 2 rows standing, 1 row seated. The backdrop was an airfield hangar, the clouds above them light but overcast. Nothing about it looked unusual until you counted. 21, Fallon murmured. There should only be 20. Yes, I said. Exactly. We both stared at the back row, third from the right, where the extra face stared back. It wasn't misaligned or blurred. It wasn't even spectral in the traditional sense. It was just there, too clear, too deliberate, its eyes fixed not on the camera, but on the man beside it. Could be an early composite, Fallon said softly. Some squadrons did that, pasted in crewmen who died before the print was taken. I shook my head. The metadata shows it was a single exposure, no composites, no retouching, and I found something else. When I ran spectral enhancement, the face moved between scans. He frowned. Moved? I mean, not statistically, literally. In one scan, the eyes are open, in another, closed. For a moment, Fallon just looked at me, not unkindly, but cautiously. Ms. Shaw, I assume you've been spending quite a lot of time with this photograph. I'm not imagining it, I whispered. He smiled again, polite, reassuring. I didn't say you were. Let's check the accession records, see where this came from. He opened a drawer and pulled out a leather-bound ledger, its spine cracked with use. Running a finger down the entries, he paused halfway through. Ah, Northumberland Squadron, August 1940. Donated by Captain Thomas Leary, RAF retired. Accession date, March 1952. My pulse quickened. That's impossible. Fallon raised an eyebrow. Why? Because, I said, sliding my own notes across the table. I digitized this print last week. The accession form I signed says October 2024. He studied the paper, then the photograph, then me. We've had this image in the collection since 1952, he said quietly. I can even show you the catalogue card. He turned to the filing cabinet behind him, withdrew a yellowed index card, and laid it beside the print. There it was, the same squadron name, same photograph dimensions, same reference number. Only the handwriting differed, neat, looping cursive instead of my own messy pencil scrawl. And under digitized by, it read, M. Shaw, University of Cambridge, 1952. The room tilted slightly. I felt the blood drain from my face. That's my name, I said. Fallon smiled, but his voice trembled now. It can't be. The program you're part of didn't exist then. I stared at the card. The ink was faded but real, indented into the card's surface, aged to brown. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a forgery. It was time. Fallon exhaled slowly. I think perhaps you've stumbled into an administrative curiosity, he said, though his tone had lost its earlier calm. We've seen clerical coincidences before, duplicates, mistaken identity. There's a signature, I interrupted. He looked down again. Sure enough, at the bottom of the card, in fountain pen, was a signature that matched mine exactly. I backed away from the table. I didn't sign that. Fallon didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the photograph, where the overhead lamp now cast an odd glare across the glossy surface. For a moment, I thought it was the reflection of the light. But then I saw the faintest ripple move across the image. The back row seemed subtly different. One of the men, the extra face, now leaned slightly forward, his mouth open just enough to show teeth. Fallon blinked. Did you see that? I don't. He grabbed his glasses, bent closer. It's like the emulsion's alive. I took another step back. The air in the room had changed, heavier now, like before a storm. Fallon reached toward the photo with trembling fingers. Don't touch it, I said. But he already had. The lights flickered. For half a second, every bulb in the room went out, plunging us into darkness. When they came back, the photograph was blank, just paper, no faces, no uniforms, nothing but a faint grey haze. Fallon's mouth worked soundlessly. What in God's... Then, slowly, the image began to return, one figure at a time, as if redeveloping before our eyes. But there was a difference. The back row had grown. There were now 22 men, and the newest face was his. I screamed. Fallon stumbled back, his chair crashing against the wall. The photograph slipped from the table and landed face up on the floor. He reached for it, instinctively, stupidly, and the instant his fingers brushed the edge, every light in the room exploded at once. When I could see again, he was gone. Only his glasses lay beside the fallen print. I picked them up with shaking hands. They were still warm. Security came minutes later, a blur of flashlights, radios, confusion. They found nothing. No Fallon, no sign of struggle, no blood. Just me, hysterical, clutching an old photo and muttering about faces. They escorted me outside, gently but firmly. One guard asked where I'd gotten the print. I said I'd brought it from the university. He exchanged a look with the curator on duty, who shook her head. The RAF Museum doesn't borrow from Cambridge, she said. We received that photograph 70 years ago. She paused, her voice softening. It's been part of our permanent collection ever since. I looked down at the folder in my hands. Empty. Somewhere inside the museum, the photograph I'd brought had vanished. But on the information desk, under glass, hung a framed copy of the Northumberland Squadron group portrait, 21 men smiling faintly at the camera. Only this time, when I looked closer, there were 22. And in the back row, far left, half obscured by shadow, stood a woman in a university lanyard. Her expression was blank, her eyes open. My own.